Welcome. This is, of course, coming at a particularly tense and important time. But in truth, this has been a conversation. I'm going to mute everybody. Don't worry, Ben, I'm going to let you unmute. I was about to say that this comes at a particularly tense and important time, but in truth, it's long overdue, as we have had, I won't say on again, off again, because truthfully, it was never off, but it was sort of dormant for a while, a relationship with New Israel Fund and of Canada, and certainly an interest and support of very much of their work. Nobody agrees on everything. It wouldn't be a Jewish community if we all did. But the underlying values of New Israel Fund of Canada very much align with those of your rabbis and those of the Reform movement. And we come to you at this time to really engage with New Israel Fund, as we have been and continue to engage with the entities of the Reform Movement of Canada and the Reform Movement in Israel, to make sure that our voice and our values are heard and are materialized in the work that is happening in Israel. And particularly at this time, to get an update not only on the broader strokes of what New Israel Fund of Canada is doing, and for some that might be brand new information, but also specifically with regard to the protests and the fight to defend democracy in Israel, where they are really very much on the ground and on the front lines, and to hear about the work that they're doing, hopefully to hear some of the successes that they're making, and also what we can do to support that work. So with that as an introduction, I'm just going to give a couple of, Ben, you're a co-host. I think you can screen share and do anything you'd like. I am going to really turn it over to Ben to begin with, but invite you at some point to ask questions. And I think Ben will take your questions, and Rabbi Brown and I are here. We can moderate a little, but there's only going to be about 15 of us, I think, if everyone shows up. And I know that Ben can handle that. And we are as much students as we are facilitators this evening. So Ben, I turn it over to you. Ben, we can't hear you.
I was double muted. This is better? Okay. Thanks, Rabbi Dan. Thanks, Rabbi Carey. Thank you all for tuning in this evening, for joining as you munch your meals and handle evening affairs like kids or grandkids. My name is Ben, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. Look, this is, I think, how we can do this conversation. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for. And I want to tell you a little bit about what's happening on the ground. Perhaps some things that you see bits and pieces of in the news, but pieces that I definitely know are hard to really get a feel for so far away over here, which is like, what does the opposition look like, and how is Israeli society responding, especially progressive Israeli society in this moment, to these challenges. And I'm very happy to get into why is this happening, and what are the details of the various legislative proposals, and what does it mean and their implications. But I do believe that there's a lot of that information out there. There's a lot of, I know that as part of the Reform movement, you guys have great sources of information there, and I know that you've been hearing from them. So I want to be sure that you have the sense that there is some hope before us, and some sense that in the long run, at least, Israeli society has within it what is necessary to turn itself around. I'm not going to be Pollyannish that we can win tomorrow. But we do believe that Israel has deep within it its founding values still, and that democracies go through tough times, and then ultimately we'll find our way out of this. But I'll give away my thesis is that New Israel Fund doesn't believe that they can do it alone. That there is a rich and deep Israel diaspora partnership that really we have always depended on each other for lots of things, and in this moment, Israel depends on us for a kind of support that has been growing over the years and it desperately needs now. So that's what I hope we will do tonight. I want to save lots of time for questions and answers. We have about an hour for this, or did you want to go longer? About an hour? Okay. So
We really have as long as you're awake for, but we'll go for an hour. So it's a Zoom, so it's hard for the.
Yeah.
My former board president said the mind cannot endure more than cannot absorb more than the tush can endure. So.
I'm happy to stay a little bit longer for those who are willing to keep discussing in particular. So just a little bit of background about me. So I am a little bit of an unusual Jew to be doing this work and to be a Jewish communal professional, really. I'm the product of 2 generations of intermarriage. My one born Jewish grandparent fled Poland in the 20s. His family perished, but he escaped to Costa Rica, of all places, and married a Catholic Costa Rican woman who converted. There's no paperwork. I did not ask my grandma, like, hand over your conversion documents. I want to see the proof. They had all 3 of my aunts there, Etty, Scheindel, and Tema in Costa Rica. Later, they moved to LA, and that's where my mom grew up, Fega. And later on, my mom married another Catholic guy from California, who also converted later in life when I was 10. And on top of that, we lived in, my father was in the military. So I grew up a Jew in like Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, Texas, places in California that aren't so big, ultimately in Oregon. And so I grew up in a place where I didn't really know any other Jews. But what was there in my house? There was the Jewish bookcase full of my father's conversion books. To be a Jew, to pray as a Jew, folklore, traditions, we were really sort of self-reliant. Boxes would be mailed to us from relatives in other places of like Hanukkah candles and gefilte fish. Can you imagine boxes, like mailing those giant cans of gefilte fish? That's how they would arrive. And really, I wanted to know who my people were. So I read everything about them and I consumed everything about them, about us. I really wanted to meet my tribe. And, flash forward many years, I ended up on a liberal campus during the Second Intifada. And it was a Jesuit Catholic social justice focused campus. And so I, again, was not around a lot of other Jews. But a bunch of all my friends were going to do well-meaning social service abroad, international development or conflict resolution. And so where would a good Jewish boy in the, early 2000s go to do well-meaning work in the world? I went to Israel. I was going to solve the conflict. I was going to make peace between Jews and Arabs. Very, very naive at the time. But what happened is I landed on the ground and I started doing a bunch of volunteering. And I remember landing at a Bedouin camp, like a corrugated aluminum shantytown. The kids had no shoes. There was no running water. There was no power. And there was a big Jewish neighborhood right nearby that had red tile roofs and lush gardens and green grass and all kinds of public services. And I think that was my first NIF moment when I realized even if we solved the sort of ethnic national thing here, conflict, there's enough just socioeconomic inequality to keep me working until the day that I die. And I was there and I was obviously volunteering with organizations that were trying to change things, social change groups trying to make it better. And I wondered, like, where is the diaspora in all of this? This was not on the birthright brochures. This was not with all the Hasbara talking points about how great Israel is. Something was deeply wrong here. Something was hidden from me in how my community talked about Israel. And so I went home and I was like on fire. I was like absolutely on fire, as if I was the first one to discover that Israel was an imperfect place. So that question, where are diaspora Jews? Who are my people? Who are really my people? Those are the questions that have like motivated me in my Jewish life. And only later did I realize, of course, the Israelis that I was volunteering with, both Jews and Arabs, in some of the poorest places in Israel, some of the hardest places in Israel, of course, they were my tribe. they were progressive people committed to equality and democracy and fairness, and an economy that didn't leave anybody behind, to opposing racism, all of these things. And of course, later I would figure out that they were all funded and supported and part of the New Israel Fund community in Israel. And that when I came back, and the people who I was talking to very excitedly about these urgent matters that I had seen, of course, I would later discover that those mentors of mine were all already donors to the New Israel Fund or supporters in some way. That's like quest to figure that out is why I've made this my life's work so far. I've been working for New Israel Fund in one capacity or another for 15 years. And I was a volunteer before that. So what is it? What is the New Israel Fund? I would later figure out that Israel is a startup nation, right? It was, so many things had to be invented and developed from a very young democracy. And one of those things, in addition to the high tech and all the universities and the incredible hospital research and medical, discoveries, was also a startup civil society. So civil society is a layer of society which advocates for individual citizens and for groups that are disempowered. And so, of course, NIF got its start in the 60s and 70s. What was happening in the diaspora in the 60s and 70s? Well, it was the civil rights movement and the feminist movement and all these things that were happening. And when diaspora Jews were saying, I want to give tzedakah to Israel, of course they wanted to give tzedakah to Israel, to things that matched their values at home. And in Israel at that same time, there were Israelis trying to figure that out for themselves. Also, there's a women's movement and a racial equality movement. And those things look a little different in Israel than they do over here, but they were the same things. And so the match was made that people who wanted to make their philanthropy to Israelis fighting for progressive values and causes. So in the 1980s, New Israel Fund of Canada specifically was the first charity to fund the Israel feminist movement. And it was the first one to train Israeli human rights lawyers, the civil rights bar, and to send young Canadians to volunteer with not like an immigration absorption center, but like a minority rights advocacy group. In the 1990s, the New Israel Fund of Canada was the first Canadian charity to support minorities and other vulnerable populations in front of the High Court, that they would litigate to get their equality, including Arab citizens. In the 2000s, the New Israel Fund of Canada was the first Canadian charity to fund Israel's, young, growing LGBTQ rights organizations. It was all, as well as the Israeli movements fighting for the environment, growing realization in the 2000s within the Orthodox religious community that extremism was growing. So just think about where we are today. And in the 2010s, the New Israel Fund of Canada was the first Canadian charity to put Palestinian citizens of Israel on prominent Canadian stages to hear their stories and to learn about their needs, as well as to deal with the thorny issues of human rights in the occupied territories. So NIF has always been funding the next cutting edge thing, dealing with the difficult issues. So we have a high tolerance for Israel as an imperfect place because we support the Israelis seeking to make it better. So it led, Haaretz newspaper to say that there, quote, there is no significant socially minded organization in Israel today that does not owe its existence to the New Israel Fund. That's a pretty high endorsement. So that's the backdrop. That's who I am, and that's who New Israel Fund is. I meant to share, like, this is just basically who we are. Our purpose and mission is to protect and advance democracy and equality in Israel. And this is where we come to the present moment. Already a decade ago, we were using this slogan, protecting and advancing democracy and equality in Israel. And a decade ago, a lot of people kind of rolled their eyes. Democracy, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Equality, Israel's got way more equality than, lots of places next door. But then Brexit happened, and then Trump got elected. And then, we saw, at the same time as we saw populist and liberalism spreading around the globe, and all these young democracies like Turkey, Hungary, Romania, the Philippines, and Israel not to mention the big strong ones, began to seriously roll back their courts, curb their free press, undermine the separation of powers between governments. And of course, a decade ago, we saw, we, the New Israel Fund, and the Israelis that we support in Israel, saw the telltale signs of that exact same stuff in Israel. In fact, Israel was the sort of canary in the coal mine. When you look at, when you poll the Israeli public about their belief in basic democratic principles, say like the right of that men and women are equal, that they are capable of the same things, that a free press and an independent judiciary and checks and balances, a vibrant civil society, the basic idea that all races are equal and that democracy is supposed to be some compromise between different groups. Right now, we enjoy a majority. There's like 60-something% of the Israeli public that believes that. But the younger you go, it deteriorates. Among teenage Israelis, it's less than 50%. Less than 50% of Israeli young people believe in those basic tenets of democracy, which we saw already a decade ago, which is incredibly worrisome. So already a decade ago, we could foresee that there was a moment like this coming in Israel's future. The trend in the diaspora is a little bit the opposite direction. The younger you go among young people in the diaspora, especially, but Jews specifically, the more and more liberal you get. So there is already a growing gap between the Israeli people and then between the Israeli Jewry and diaspora Jewry, like just to paint the sort of like cosmic backdrop in which we're talking about. So at that time, New Israel Fund began to make investments in what we considered initiatives for democracy. And today, I'm here to tell you about some of those things. And the other things that we could never have anticipated that have come about now. I want to tell you for the big picture at the moment, like what do we see? We see an Israeli population that has gone through 5 elections in a series of, just a few years, 3 years. And each time those votes were deadlocked 50-50. The last election, it was 49.5% of the population versus 49.5% of the population. And due to the quirk of electoral, processes, this coalition happened to get 64 seats, just above a bare majority. It is once again led by Netanyahu. And normally Netanyahu is in the middle of his coalition. He had people to his right and people to his left. This time, no one to the center of him, in the center of the political map, would dare make a coalition with him because of his own corruption situation. So his being embroiled in multiple charges of corruption has led to sort of like the never Trumpers of the Republican Party. There's a right wing in Israel that refuses to sit with Bibi. And so now Bibi has made a partnership entirely with the furthest right wing extremes. And he worked very hard to make sure that every single vote to his right would get counted. And so what we have seen is that not just that the right wing is in power, the most right wing government we've ever seen, but that the content of the right wing, the people who represent the right wing are even more extreme than they have ever been. And all I need to do is point out some of the things that we've seen in the headlines the past week. There's a few particular individuals who are ministers in his government that just continually say and do terrible things. Bezalel Smotrich, Palestinians aren't real people, wipe out the Palestinian village of Huwara, Ben Gvir, Itamar Ben Gvir, another extremist minister who continually incites violence against Arabs or leftists, and now he's a police minister. So I don't need to get into the details of all of that stuff. We can ask questions, but I don't want to dwell on it because it'll take us forever. The litany of things that concern us is really long. But where's the hopeful stuff? Look, 11 weeks ago, a small group of civil society NGOs decided to hold a protest. We had already seen the government get elected. We had already seen the government go through negotiations and promise itself all kinds of things. We had already seen the coalition publish its coalition agreements that was a detailed written list of all the policies they were going to change, which were terribly frightening and which they are currently going through and ticking them off. And this group of civil society organizations, some of the most important civil rights, minority rights, women's rights organizations in Israel, decided to hold a protest. And they were some of the primary organizations that knew Israel Fund funds. And we gave them an emergency grant for the speakers and for the permit and for the barricades and everything they need in order to hold their protest. And there was maybe 11,000 people there. That 11,000 people, that ball that we set rolling, 11,000 people became 500,000 the past 2 weekends. And what we see are incredible, unprecedented levels of opposition coming out in Israel. We see teachers groups, nurses groups, the lawyers, the judges, the bankers, the economists, every fathomable unit of the IDF, writing letters, protest, demonstrating physically, saying that they'll refuse to show up, going on strike. Very notable when IDF units say that they will go on strike to protest. Something is really shifting in Israel. Something is really shifting, and that is good. The last election was not about democracy. The last election was about Bibi's corruption, essentially. And now we see in opinion polls of the Israeli public some very hopeful things. One especially that even people who voted this government in say, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up for giving away millions more shekels in aid to the Haredi community. I didn't sign up for an encroachment of religious coercion into my private life or into my city. I didn't sign up for, I signed up for more security. You sold me on more security, but the people that you put in charge of security are inflaming the situation and, causing all kinds of extra concern. That's hugely significant, that big portions of the population are coming off the fence. And what else can civil society do in this moment? That's like the really big question. What can civil society be doing, and what can you help them do? So we're seeing this in as we analyze what is happening and what are the odds of us winning? I think we have to be realistic that they are in power and they can do whatever they want, but they will also face another election. So what do we have to do? In the short term, we have to support we have to delay as much as possible the bad things that the government wants to do. We need to build the movement for the day after, and we have to coordinate all these different pieces. And then there's long-term work. So what do those three things look like? There's 1, 2, 3, like the delay, build, and coordinate. So at the moment, this government is advancing all kinds of policies, not to mention legislation, but they're advancing all kinds of administrative policies that they have perfect permission to do that affect minorities, women, Bedouin citizens, whomever. And so some of the most important things that civil society can do can just do what they always do, which is throw up roadblocks in the process. So this government in particular, or as an example, believes that the Bedouin are taking over the Negev and that they should be, they need to be reservationized into a few little towns. That is not an accurate way to look at the situation. There's like a very tiny amount of Bedouin who want a very tiny amount of the land that they have historically lived on. And there's no reason in the giant expanse of the Negev that they should be kicked off that part of the land to build a new Jewish town, right? It's very simple. Let some of the people live where they live. They're not in anybody's way. But this government wants to reservationize them and will demolish, large expanses if allowed. But there is still a bureaucratic process. So, civil liberties groups can come in and say, well, you can't do this. Let's, they'll petition in the courts or at the urban planning office or the regional planning department, all kinds of roadblocks to delay something like demolishing an entire village or a bunch of houses. And you know what? The difference between 1 day and 6 months is everything to a family that has no running water, no power, and their kids have no shoes, right? That may actually make the difference between, the village being demolished under this government at all. When it comes to, say, the Gay Pride Parade, this government will likely pass all kinds of legislation or make it much more easier or favorable for cities and municipalities to say, we don't want the Gay Pride Parade here, we don't want. But what we do see at the local level is that municipalities also have the ability to be a bulwark against the central government. They have control over what parades get to be and what the public regulations are. So what you see is religious freedom groups and women's rights groups working with city municipalities in this moment in order to highlight municipal authority and power, that they can do things like, who gets money, if you're a Reform temple in Israel, where do you get your money from? You don't get it from the central government, but you can get it from your municipality. Municipalities can be a way that you can ensure some kind of equality, and that you can protect public spaces, say the town square, or public ceremonies from the requirement to say, like, make it Orthodox friendly, so men on one side and women on the other, or to gender segregate bus lines in your city. Again, that is a place where you have liberal spaces that can be defended if people are ready to, if they know how. In Israel this fall, in October, are the municipal elections. And municipal elections in Israel is kind of like Israel's midterms. It's a significant moment where Israel will see which way the political winds are blowing. And the efforts at the local level, again, in order to protect vulnerable populations, Arab citizens, gay citizens, liberal denominations of Judaism. These are places where, if we see vibrant opposition, efforts to protect those people, that sends a powerful signal about the elections that will come at the national level afterwards. Again, this is like, how can civil society make a difference in this moment? How can it mobilize to protect specific populations? These are very real policy things. This is not just like, well, we're going to demonstrate, and a bigger demonstration, the government will listen to us. That was the first thing. The second thing that I think is really important is building a bigger movement for pro-democracy. Like I said, the last election was about Bibi. It wasn't about democracy. But that issue is very, very much crystallized in the minds of the Israeli public. That is what the slogans at the protests are. That is what the content of all these letters being written by the doctors and the lawyers and the IDF units. There is, the next election is gonna be about democracy. So are we building a stronger pro-democracy movement? And by pro-democracy, I don't mean the left or just the progressives. Like I said, the pro-democracy movement also includes a significant number of what we would characterize as right-wing people who also see that a fair democracy is not a majoritarian democracy, that a true liberal democracy protects people of all kinds. So what does that mean in this moment? It means that there's a lot of different groups coming out to protest, but do they know each other? And are they talking about the same issues in the same way? They don't have to, but it's a fascinating and important moment for the leaders of those different groups and different sectors of society that understand they're all equally under threat, to be brought together and to understand each other's issues. Some of the most important work, I think, is done at a leadership level at the moment, where simply protesters representing a Mizrahi neighborhood in Haifa will meet and work with people who live just 2 neighborhoods over from them, who are Palestinian citizens, who have been talking about these issues for a much longer time. What does it mean that they live in the same city? They've never talked to each other. They've never seen a common rubric under which their needs are shared. This is that moment. And so when New Israel Fund enters as an agent, We are funding the kinds of leadership programs that bring them together. We are funding the emergence of new organizations, new activist networks, new groups, all out of a belief that the grassroots bottom up is really what matters the most. The politicians rely on it for everything. So can we build the movement? Can we turn some of those groups that are just suddenly exploded into action? Can we turn them into an institution? Or can we introduce them to their peers in other parts of the country? That's the second thing: delay, build, and coordinate. And I think the coordination work is one piece that I think is particularly interesting. The reform movement sits on a thing called the Forum Against Women's Exclusion. The Forum for Women's Exclusion is a group of Israel's 17 largest and most important feminist, LGBTQ, and religious freedom groups. It's existed for 5 or 6 years already. They coordinate their work, and they have been responding to efforts to say, gender segregate all kinds of public spaces under the last government, under Bibi's previous governments. In this moment, however, they are the strongest, most powerfully organized, most well-prepared sector of all of the protest groups. It includes the Israel Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement. This coalition of like 17 groups, I'm sure you've seen pictures out of Israel with people wearing the red cloaks and white hats of Handmaid's Tale. Even Margaret Atwood noticed that this Margaret Atwood was the author of Handmaid's Tale, and she saw on social media like 50 people that look like it's out of a TV show marching, and she was like, I can't even imagine that this is a real thing. I wrote about it in a book, and it became a TV show, and now it's used for a tool of social change. Part of the reason of the vibrancy and the visibility of the women's movement in Israel is because it's been it has made a purposeful effort to build relationships and to strengthen itself, to be smart and to work across social divides. That the Arab women's groups work with the secular Jewish women's groups, that the secular Jewish women's groups sit with the Orthodox Jewish feminist groups, that sit with the Masorti movement and all the other pieces. That is incredibly powerful, and that is some of also the work that New Israel Fund does. Half of what we do in Israel is we give money to groups that are doing good things. The other half of the money that we spend in Israel is actually just coordinating and organizing and training and helping leaders be better leaders. So there is a similar roundtable around which all of the human rights groups sit. There is a similar roundtable around which all the legal groups sit. There is a similar roundtable around which all the Jewish Arab groups sit, that are run by New Israel Fund. We, as the central funder of the progressive movement in Israel, we're the ones who can say, come to the table and have a discussion. We can do research for them. We can pay for training and coordinating. It's not easy to work lots of different social change groups together. But if you invest the time, if you invest in the relationships, the sum becomes greater than the whole of its parts. And what we're seeing now is that women's groups and Arab citizens groups and say environmental groups, they didn't used to want to deal with each other because they had different issues, different problems. The government had a different relationship to them. Society had a different levels of support. What we're seeing now is that everybody gets, all of civil society understands that they are all equally under threat, that their achievements will all be rolled back if there is unfettered power held by the central government. And so what you see for the first time is that not only do these separate hubs, these separate coalitions are working much better together, but also they're all working together as a bigger whole. And that's why you see so many different groups coming out, so many different sectors coming out to the protests. I think it's a hopeful note. I think there's a lot more that we can talk about, but I just wanted to paint a picture of there's just so many different things happening. But I think the big question is, what's the reasonable outcome? The reasonable outcome at the moment is probably that some of the bad legislation will pass, and a lot of it will get watered down, abandoned, compromised and abandoned after the Passover Knesset break. And the only reason that's happening, the only reason that there's any compromise at all, is because of the vibrant public mass response, which has been led and fueled by civil society at every level, in every single city, in every sector. And the really great thing about Israel, say different than Hungary, different than the Philippines, different than the UK. The Israeli state has a diaspora around the world that is entirely equal in size. Actually a little bit bigger. Global Jewry, the diaspora Jewry is just a little bit bigger than the total Israeli Jewish population. We all live in democratic countries. The US, Canada, the UK, France, those are like the top 4 Jewish populations. And then you've got Australia and South Africa and Germany and the other places. Every single one of those populations understands what it's like to be a minority and to rely on the courts and a free press and the media and civil society to protect our rights. There is a powerful diaspora community that believes in liberal democracy. And the last thing I wanted to share with you is just a little bit of research about that we, New Israel Fund of Canada, did in here, just to make this point. We did this poll just over a month ago, and what you can, maybe these numbers might surprise you, but I hope they don't. Most Canadian Jews oppose the policies of this government, and most Canadian Jews believe they're going in the wrong direction. Almost 60% of Canadian Jews believe that Israel's going the wrong direction. Barely 13 said that Israel's going in a good direction. And then if you want to look at the specific things, the specific proposals, look at these margins. That light blue bar, that's the really big one. Do you support or oppose removing the grandparents clause from the law of return? What's that, like a 4-to-1 ratio? Oppose, opposition to support. Same thing with judicial reform, even bigger for gender segregation. It's 83% or something of Canadian Jews oppose any efforts to do more gender segregation in Israel. Same thing with anti-LGBTQ legislation, or any of these moves to prevent Arab citizens from getting elected in Israel. And when you look at more settlements, supporting more settlements or supporting annexation, the ratio is a little bit lower, but really it's still 2-to-1. More Canadian Jews don't want these things than the ones who do want these things. And when you look at, say, the most offensive of the Israeli ministers and the racist things that, say, Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir are saying, again, nearly 60% of Canadian Jews say it's okay to tell our government, don't have any relations with him. Like, he does not represent us. He does not represent us. We don't like him. He's a racist. We wouldn't support any other racist having a relationship with the government of Canada. So these things, I think, shouldn't come as a surprise to Canadian Jews. But I don't know that that's the way that we have always thought about ourselves. We've always assumed that Canadian Jews are a little bit more conservative. Well, it sort of like doesn't matter in this moment. We are the same as American Jews and the UK Jewish community and Australian community. We are united globally with how worrisome these events are. So having laid all that out there, what are we doing in our community? What can civil society reasonably do? I'm happy to take a big pause for everyone to take a deep breath and again realize that, like, this is good. What we have seen in the past coming out of Israeli society is good, and that there is a very strong and powerful liberal DNA in the country. There is also a very strong and powerful conservative DNA in that country that we can't take lightly. But I don't think all is lost. the promise of being able to support some of these individuals, some of these organizations, they really need the help right now. So let me just stop there, and I want to open it up for anything, whatever is pressing on your mind, whether it's about things that I mentioned or something else entirely.
Ben, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Ellie, before we get to your question, I'm going to take the rabbi's prerogative and ask the first one. Ben, I just wanted to clarify something that you said, because you said that you think that this bad legislation will pass, but that after Pesach, it will get watered down. Can you explain how that might work and what that looks like?
Yeah. So the present situation is that the current government saw that they could ram everything through by all of the legislation they wanted. There's a package. There's a series of legislation. There's stuff to reform the judge selection. There's stuff to make Netanyahu and some other ministers unimpeachable or safe from their corruption trials. There's legislation in order to make to diminish the role of the Supreme Court, like make it unable to exercise judicial review or be able to, like, a notwithstanding clause override. There's other initiatives, a lot of legal initiatives which reshape the totality of the judiciary and pull out all the stops and speed bumps and yield signs over majoritarian power of the executive branch. So if it were one piece of legislation, that would be different. But actually, it's a whole series of legislation. And what the situation is at the moment is the coalition has said very clearly that they're gonna ram through before April 2nd. So the last day of the Knesset, of the sitting Knesset is next Thursday, March 30th. The judge selection bill. So allow them control over who gets to be judges. So they'll try and lower the age. So they will forcibly retire the most liberal judges who are currently the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice. They will restructure who, like the political branch's involvement in who gets to be on the committee to pick the judges. And they'll take that as their prize. And having seen the huge amount of opposition, especially the economic warnings about some of the more drastic things like instituting a notwithstanding clause, they will break for Passover, hope the protest movement loses steam, and then let some of the worst legislation, like the notwithstanding clause, get watered down or die, and they will call it a compromise. And that was what they can unfold with lots of other bills. They're willing to negotiate and let some of those slide, but they're going to take as their chief accomplishment one of the primary things that they've always wanted, which is much more conservative justices on the bench. But a lot of analysis sort of pulling that apart. So what I'll share with you is what people wiser than I say. One is a couple of things that you mentioned. Sure, there's a growing ultra-Orthodox population in Israel, for sure. Like, that's a little part of this, but it's not actually enough to explain the whole story. Another piece of it is the governments over the past, Netanyahu's government, even though it has been not as right-wing as it is now, their side of the political spectrum has always harbored antipathy to democracy and a belief that Israel should be a democracy only for the Jews and not a democracy for other minority populations like Palestinian citizens. So they have slowly, there's a couple of effects that a decade under Netanyahu has resulted in. One of which is constant fire breathing against leftists, human rights, Arab citizens and Arab equality. And so the atmosphere has just been very, been a lot of incitement, honestly. You just remember a couple elections ago where he was saying that, like, the Arabs are coming out to vote, they're stealing votes, they're lying.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
This is not new, what we're seeing. right? The past governments under Netanyahu passed all kinds of laws that took away rights from Arab citizens and made it hard for them. So you see, in an atmosphere in which there is an ethnic conflict, in which there is periodic terrorism, the atmosphere of fear and distrust is the fuel of populist liberalism, right? In Europe, it's, oh no, the Syrian refugees are flooding us, they're going to take away our country. Or in Hungary, it's George Soros is some scary foreigner, he's going to take away our sovereignty. You know, all of these scary outside boogeymen that a strong man uses to shore up support and really tell a story about the country under threat. And in Israel, that story is very appreciably, the Arabs are going to get us, and this is a Jewish country, and it's only a Jewish country, and it's only for us, and they want to undo everything. So that is very effective in Israel. And one of the consequences of the policies that his government has put in over the years is the education system has slowly been emptied of civics. And they've added a lot of Jewish national content. So, you know, they read the Torah, or they read the, pieces of Jewish tradition, but they only read the pieces where the Jews militarily conquer somebody, or something really glorifying about, our right to the land. But they don't read a lot of the, more ethical bits. They don't read the prophets caring for the weak and the poor. And what that has left is, it has the atmosphere of fear and a lack of actual civics of how democracy works. Plus, the regular fears of young people these days that they won't be able to afford a house and the neighborhood they grow up in. They can't, where will they go to get a job? All of that regular Israel is a country with the largest socioeconomic inequality, second to, wait for it, the United States. So that also fuels discontent and fear, and populist liberalism is all about finding a scapegoat. So that's why there's a lot of factors, but there's no one easy fix, right? There's a lot. There's actually a lot. There's a couple concrete things, but I want to take a step back also. The backdrop is that this is an inflection moment in the diaspora-Israel relationship. Look, people, those of us who have been following these issues for a long time, or have been, a part of a Reform community and know the position of Reform Jews in Israel in relation to the state, lack of religious church separation and recognition for our movements and things. This is the scope of this is what's worrying at the moment, but it's not like we've never heard of it before. It's not like we never knew that there were extremist Jews in Israel, and that they did terrible things and they said terrible things, or that or that society was imperfect or unfair. This is a moment, however, when lots of people in Israel and in the diaspora are realizing that the stakes are really high. But I showed you those public opinion numbers. Just think of any issue here in Canada or anywhere else where there's a clear majority population in favor of something, but they just can't get it through, they just can't get it implemented, Just because there's mass support for something doesn't mean that it translates into action. This moment, we are building the pro-democracy diaspora movement. This is a moment where people who never, it feels like people had their best friend, Israel, they grew up with Israel, they liked Israel, Israel was a positive force in their life, and then suddenly they realized that Israel has a nightlife, an alter ego in the evening where it's secretly a homophobic racist, and they're like, how did I never know? There's a piece of this which is going to forever change the relationship of Israel and the diaspora. Israel is now a place that that could do these things. What are we going to do about it? I think it impacts how we educate about Israel. We always want, say, Muslim communities to come out against Muslim extremism. Who are the Jewish communities coming out against Jewish extremism, right? It's not fair to ask that of other people if we are not doing it ourselves. If we are not aware of what the problems are, how can we defeat them? I think this rescripts a bunch of how we just talk about Israel, how we engage with Israel, how we educate about Israel. When we go to Israel, who do we meet with? Who do we talk to? When we give our tzedakah, where does it go? Can you say that it's going to, you know, at least something constructive? But, you know, there's lots of really great things to support in Israel. Forests and hospitals and universities. But this is a real moment where there's billions of dollars a year of diaspora philanthropy that goes into Israel, and the support of our governments on all kinds of fronts. Where is that philanthropy and where is that political support helping specifically the side of Israel, which is pulling for democracy? And I mean that in not a left or right kind of way, but there's right-wing, centrist, left-wing, Arab, religious, secular, you know, Jews of color, Ashkenazi elite, you name it. This is the pro-democracy movement in Israel is as beautiful and diverse as Israel itself, including Haredi and including Orthodoxy. So what voices are we empowering when we deal with Israel at all in our communities at home? And I think that means that there's just a higher level for us to engage with the tough stuff. That's the big picture, I think, at this moment. Specifically, you can do a couple things. If you want the Canadian government to speak up on, say, when Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir says something horribly offensive, which is a chilul Hashem to Israel's reputation around the world, I think it's okay to tell your MP, I don't agree with that, and the Jewish community does not agree with that, and we are not going to. It's an incorrect stereotype to say that the Jewish community is just like, I don't know, always a fan of Bibi. They could be forgiven for having that impression. I think it's okay, given the stakes in this moment, to do a little bit of that. That's the first big thing. The second big thing is obviously change where you give your shekels, or increase the shekels you're giving. Look, you can give to the New Israel Fund. I really hope, like, that's my job. That's what we do. If you make a donation to the New Israel Fund, you will be supporting the kinds of organizations that I've described. I'll give to Dan and Carrie a link to, like, a description of all the things that we're funding at the moment. And some of those things are emergency projects dealing with, say, helping the protests become more diverse, or responding to some of the recent violence in Hawara, you know, the rampage that was there, by helping with human rights monitoring in some of the areas of the West Bank. There will be more emergency fundraising needs. There will be more things that we will try and fund over there as the politics of the year unfolds. Consider where you're giving your shekels. Thank you, Jen, for the donation link. The other part of it, this is part 3, is really concrete. Look, big groups of people who believe a thing don't result in change unless they're connected to each other. So your congregation and your leadership and you all have taken a first step in saying, I want to learn about this and I want to be connected. So are you talking about this with others? Are you helping them join? You know, they can be joining your congregation. They can also be joining the mailing list of the New Israel Fund or any of the other liberal Canadian groups. They can be joining the list of Ours of Canada. These are groups that are committed to addressing these issues and talking about them and giving people something to do. Could be giving shekels, could be talking to their MP, could be engaging with others, but we are building a movement for Israel's long-term democratic safety, democratic health. Let's be honest, we are not going to defeat everything this government does. Even the little things are not going to be that great. It will take us 10, 20, 30 years for us really to feel like we have put extremism back in the box it came from. to repair the damage to checks and balances, to make sure that all citizens of Israel, no matter what their walk of life, are treated equally and are recognized and have a shared stake in society and a share in decision making. That's going to take a long time. Going back to the way it was is not what we're talking about. It was already not good enough. The reform movement, the Masorti movement, Arab citizens, gay rights, women's equality, a whole bunch, the conflict itself. We're not content with just going back to the way it was. How do we turn things around completely? It's going to require a deeper commitment of the diaspora and diaspora Jewish institutions and people being connected to the groups that are fighting here and there for that kind of relationship and those kinds of Israelis. So, you know, I hope that you'll join our mailing list, or if you're not already on ARZA or IRAC's mailing list, get on it and do some of the simple things that that we all offer you to make a difference.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. I mean, to summarize what Ben just said, and it really, I hope, underlines what we tried to communicate in the letter to the congregation, and we'll have an update about that soon. Advocate in an effective way, advocate in a way that's actually going to result in the kind of change that we want to see here in Canada in terms of policy, where we have perhaps the most influence. Change where you give your shekels or increase your shekels to support these organizations and help build the movement by connecting in people. And this is a really important part of that, because New Israel Fund, and I began our conversation tonight by saying the relationship between Temple Sholom and New Israel Fund actually goes back to, I don't know if it was here before I arrived, but shortly after I arrived, we began to have these conversations, but it's been dormant for much of that time. And that's in part because there are forces within our broader Jewish community here in Vancouver that don't want it to have a foothold here. I remember attending parlor meetings early on, and it was marginalized by those existing groups. And I think that if there's an area that we could actually work on, and I'm going to use the example of environment here and climate change, because our congregation has done work on that too. When we started talking about climate and the environment, nobody in the Jewish community was talking about it within the center of the Jewish community. And we started to talk about it as a congregation, and our goal was very clearly to get it on the agenda of Jewish Federation, and by that, the agenda of CJ. And it now is. In fact, next week I'm attending some function where they're going to recognize the high investment and partnership that the Jewish Federation has made with Hazon, which is the environmental partner group that the community has partnered with. They would not have done that if we, Temple Sholom, had not advocated for that issue. So we need to advocate for organizations like New Israel Fund, like Arts of Canada, being not only at the table, but also being part of the center and the focus. And we need to advocate to that to the Federation and CJ within the structures that exist. I don't believe in making a separate Shabbos here, but we need to bring them to our table. And that's where, and I'm going to just say this out loud, it's the quiet part out loud, we are a nearly 1,000 family congregation. We have a very large megaphone, and I just want us to use it wisely. And I think that if we were to advocate for inclusion, and Ben's survey that New Israel Fund did is a very critical one, that 60% of the Canadian Jewish community is not in favor of these reforms, and is in favor of civil rights and liberal values in Israel, of the Canadian Jewish community. If we raise that up, then the community that we give our money to, CJ and Federation, have to respond to that, because they are representative of us. And I think to Ben's point, they don't think that that's where the community is, because the loudest voices in our community are not saying that. So we need to be loud, but we need to be loud on that issue, because there we can affect change. Sorry, that's the sermon that I don't have time to give this weekend, because we have a scholar in residence, which is the last point I'll make, which is that Joel Chasnoff is joining us this weekend. And this is continuing to be part of our series of what began when we planned all of this as a celebration of Israel at 75. And it's turned into a krexing over Israel at 75. You know, the word krexing is it's Yiddish for angst and anxiety and worry out loud over Israel at 75. But come this weekend, engage with Israel on a cultural level, There'll be some humor to it because if you're not laughing, you're crying. But Joel's going to talk to this also, and it's a really important perspective to hear. And maybe not as a political bent, but as a cultural bent, which is a very, and Livia could speak to this, but we don't have time for you to do. The cultural aspects of this, the Ashkenazic Sephardic divide, the secular religious divide, are as much a part of this as it is all the other things that we've talked about tonight. Ben, I want to be conscious of the time. It's quarter to midnight, I think, where you are. So thank you. I want to give you the last word. I also want to, actually, before I do that, I want to give Rabbi Brown an opportunity if there's anything that she would like to add. Rabbi?
Thank you. And thank you, Ben, so much for sharing all those insights with us. Yeah, I mean, I think, hearing the voices of Israelis right now is really important. And, Israelis within our Vancouver community and from Israelis living in Israel, to get a sense of what's happening. I mean, I think it really is one of, certainly in my lifetime, but I think within the entire history of the state, it's really at such an inflection point. And, for us to be aware and to be able to be knowledgeable and speak with a sense of connection as diaspora Jewry, we don't have a vote, but we do have a real true connection, and it impacts us very deeply. So I hope that we can continue these conversations.
Let me close with a little story of another moment that it looked like everything was like the odds were all against us. I don't know if you guys remember back in 2018, the Netanyahu government at the time was trying to deport all the African asylum seekers out of Israel. It was a particularly upsetting moment, and they had a plan that they were just going to send all of them to Uganda or something. These are people who had from Sudan and Eritrea that had fled genocide. They were there, and there were 60,000 of them, and they were sort of unceremoniously plopped down in a poor Tel Aviv neighborhood. And the going accusation at the time was that they're criminals and rapists, and they're actually economic migrants, whatever, they don't deserve to be here, and they're threatening the Jewish character of the state. Netanyahu had a couple friends, had chosen as his political partners in this was some particularly racist people from that Tel Aviv neighborhood that were saying, oh yeah, our lives are terrible, and it's all because of these Africans here. I was there at the time. There was actually a gathering organized. It turned out to be a protest of 10,000 people from the neighborhood in South Tel Aviv that lived there, as well as, civil society, the sort of, workers' rights, migrant workers' rights, minority rights groups. And on that stage, there was Mizrahi women from the neighborhood, lived in the neighborhood their entire lives, standing on stage next to these African asylum seekers. And these women said, this neighborhood has always been poor and neglected. And we as Mizrahim in Israel have always seen our needs second rate. These nice young men who have moved into our neighborhood suffer the same discrimination from you, the sort of central government. And we don't stand for that. We're here, our problems are united. We face the same discrimination. We refuse to allow you to say that this neighborhood wants these people out, and we will stand shoulder to shoulder with these people, and we refuse to let you deport them. And when you saw El Al pilots refusing to fly planes that would that would deport these people, you saw Holocaust survivors coming out and saying, this is way too reminiscent of stuff that we saw. Again, there was a Netanyahu government of 5 or 6 years ago. They had all the votes necessary. They could do whatever they wanted. There was no stopping them. There was no way to stop them. But the power of, Mizrahi feminist activists saying our struggles are united and building a broader-based movement, which turned out 10,000 people on a Thursday night in South Tel Aviv, and the ripple effect it had on all those other people who said, we will not participate in this. The next day, Netanyahu went on TV and said, I really wish I could deport all the asylum seekers, but I can't. So he canceled his plan. And it's all because of the New Israel Fund's fault. This shadowy conspiracy leftist group that gets in the way, and they have prevented me from deporting everybody. And I don't know, we'd wear that as a badge of pride anyway. But in the next 3 days, 1,000 Israelis made a donation to the New Israel Fund, and we raised something like 300,000 shekels in a span of 3 days. Because a bunch of Israelis said, well, if he's the bad guy, and if the New Israel Fund is the bad guys to Netanyahu, we want to be with the bad guys. And that deportation was canceled, and the movement for democracy and fairness grew in Israel to the point where now 1 of every 4 donors to New Israel Fund around the world is an Israeli living in Israel. So I hope that connects a bunch of stuff that we've said about the ability of Israeli civil society against all odds to achieve some really good stuff, even when the government has everything it needs to do whatever it wants.
Ben, I want to thank you very much. I'm going to give Ben the last word though. Ben, I want to thank you very much for this evening. Thank all of you for coming out. I hope you'll join us this weekend and at other things as we are able to pull them together. The links are in the emails and the links are in the chat, and we thank you very much this evening. The recording of this will be available at some point and we can share it. It'll be on our YouTube page by tomorrow, I hope. Thank you all and good night.
Good night.
Night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.